Morning, everyone. We will get started in just a second here. Let's give everybody a minute or so to log in before we get started. All right, guys, let's go ahead and get started. Anybody have any questions for me before we get into chapter 3? Okay. Our TA is not going to be able to attend today. Ian is unavailable today. So there might not be anybody monitoring the questions on the side. If you guys have a question, do the little raise your hand icon or unmute your microphone and feel free to interject during this little lecture here. All right, guys, so you have 3 assignments this week. The first is a little quiz on the PowerPoint presentation that I put up. Remember that PowerPoint presentation gives you guys some good composition techniques and tips on writing a good thesis statement. So make sure you read all of the PowerPoint presentation. This will be the first of several essays that you'll have to write throughout the semester. We also want you guys to get used to seeing a prompt and then writing an essay because you guys will be writing essays for your midterm and final exams based on prompts that are on those exams. So make sure you guys do that. Look over the PowerPoint, take notes. They're pretty basic. I'm sure most of you know how to write a good essay, but we will be looking for those components of the essay that we mentioned in the PowerPoint presentation for this week's secondary source assignment. You also have a chapter assignment on chapter 3 that we'll go over right now. And then you have a source assignment based on an article that I've posted on our week 4 tab. So make sure you guys finish all those by tomorrow at 5. Questions on any of that?
I just got a quick question on the book.
Okay. How can I help you?
Absolutely, sir. So I got this book I rented, so I just want to know if it's the correct book.
I can't really see. Make sure that it's volume 1. Is it volume 1?
Yeah, it says Seagull Volume 1.
Yeah, that's the right one. Did you not have your book for the last 2 weeks, for the last 2 week assignments?
No, I didn't. I really got it delivered last weekend.
Okay. Did you do the first 2 chapter assignments or no?
I didn't, but I didn't like looking the answers online and stuff. But like I read your review on those, and yeah, I think it's more like my bad. I have broken English.
That's
but
okay.
Yeah, it's like it's like yeah. So I really
you just did your best based on what you could find on the internet.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's why I gave you guys the first week to get your books so that we wouldn't run into this issue. That's why we didn't start chapter work until week 2. Shoot me an email. We can talk about it later, Angel. Or I know we emailed this morning. If you want to set up a meeting, we can talk about it.
Yeah, absolutely. That was on me totally.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Well, we'll set up a meeting then, individual meeting, and we'll talk about it. Anybody else? Okay, great. Well, let's get into it. Chapter 3. All right, guys. So this week's chapter review is really, again, focusing on English colonization. We're into the 17th century now, talking about some of the last colonies set up in English colonial America in the 17th century. Make sure you guys understand this concept of mercantilism, this process that the government or the crown of England is trying to regulate economic activity to promote their imperial power. We're going to see that as we get into Charles and James and these new heads of the British Crown, that they're really focusing on foreign colonies and trying to regulate the economic process in their foreign colonies to benefit the crown. We talked about Oliver Cromwell was one of the first to really pursue this with the first Navigation Acts, and how these Navigation Acts were designed to make sure that products were transported on British vessels. This also comes down to sort of an imperial rivalry going on with the Dutch, as the Dutch were dominating international sea trade. We'll talk a little bit later about the Dutch East India Company and how that impacted this sort of rivalry between the Dutch and the English. The Navigation Act would go on to inspire the Anglo-Dutch War in 1662. This is when the New Netherlands shifts and becomes an English colony. The Dutch actually surrendered the New Netherlands. The Dutch had a very expansive colonial network by the 1660s and really couldn't maintain control of all of their colonial holdings. In many ways, the Navigation Act inspired this Anglo-Dutch War, which is basically a English versus Dutch. The Dutch didn't want to have to, or the Dutch didn't like that the English crown was targeting Dutch vessels and the East India Company. The Navigation Act was hurting the bottom line of the Dutch. Anyway, they couldn't handle all of their imperial holdings. They end up surrendering what was the New Netherlands to the English. You'll see a map on page 94 that shows this really brings together all of the eastern seaboard as an English colonial stronghold. Whereas prior to that, the English were controlled New England. Then the Dutch controlled that little strip of the New Netherlands, which included New York, or present-day New York, the Hudson Bay. And then the English controlled south of there from the Virginia colony all the way down into eventually Georgia. We'll talk a little bit later about James Oglethorpe and the Georgia colony. Then we get into the Carolinas. Make sure you guys read about the Carolinas, different sort of religious, also economic dynamics in the Carolinas. And then it gets into the last English colony established in the 17th century, and that's Pennsylvania. Make sure you guys understand the Pennsylvania colony, how it was unique compared to other colonies. That sounds like a good quiz question. So make sure you understand the religious and political dynamics of the Pennsylvania colony. It's a proprietary colony. Remember, we talked about the 3 different types of colonies: proprietary, joint stock, and royal colonies. It was a proprietary colony granted to William Penn, who is a Quaker, which is another denomination or offshoot of this Protestant movement. Remember, we talked about the Protestant Reformation sort of broke Christianity into a third branch. And then the Protestant religion itself splits into several different denominations as well. You have Calvinists and Anglicans from England, you have Presbyterians from Scotland, eventually Episcopalians, and breaks up into several different American denominations eventually. So William Penn was a Quaker. If anybody has ever eaten Quaker Oats, that's William Penn on the Quaker Oats box. And this was given as sort of a reward for William Penn's father's patronage to Charles II. So again, this is a process of an empire or an imperial crown delegating or assigning territories to individuals or joint stock companies that they really have no authorization to give, right? Pennsylvania is this large tract of land that's granted west of New York, well, sort of south and west of New York, as a gift to William Penn's father for his support of Charles II. Penn decides to take this. Oh, sorry about that. I think I just cut out for a minute. Can everybody hear me? One second, guys. Okay, I'm sorry about that, guys. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry if you hear my crazy dogs in the background. I think they just jumped on my router and disconnected my internet. All right, let's get back to it. Okay. So William Penn gets this tract of land and decides to start a sort of holy experiment, this sort of refuge for Quakers looking to establish their own colony and worship in their own sort of context or worship in their own regard. But they have some unique dynamics in the Pennsylvania colony. On one hand, you have these sort of Quaker principles that extend liberties to marginalized peoples that wouldn't normally get any agency in a colony. They believed that liberty was a universal entitlement. They let women participate in local community council meetings. They tried to include Native Americans in their colonization process. They often bought tracts of land from Native Americans, even though they were granted these tracts of land by the British Crown. They still tried to foster positive relationships with Native Americans in the region. They had no organized militia. They really promoted a peaceful community that was inclusive. So in those regards, they were a very progressive colony compared to especially these New England colonies that we read about last chapter, with these Puritans that were very restrictive, did not accept any other religious denominations. They were really intolerant of any other religious beliefs. So in many ways, Pennsylvania was very progressive. They did, however, have some very tight social restrictions. They prohibited foul language and public drunkenness and adultery, and they outlawed some of the most popular sort of pastimes of the era, bullfighting and bull baiting and cockfighting. And so in some regards, socially, it was a very sort of restricted society. You could be chastised for your public drunkenness or your personal behaviors. But they were much more progressive in terms of religious tolerance and in terms of accepting different people, cooperating with Native Americans, and giving women certain limited agencies. The government councils in Pennsylvania were made up of male taxpayers, but women did have some agency, could sit in council meetings. So because of these progressive sort of stances, Pennsylvania became very rapidly populated. It attracted immigrants from all over Europe, immigrants that felt as though they were being prosecuted or oppressed for their beliefs. So it became a very eclectic sort of colony due to these progressive beliefs. Any questions on Pennsylvania?
What were like the African Americans treated like? Were they like slaves?
So yeah, Pennsylvania did have slaves.
Okay.
It was common practice in Pennsylvania to actually release your slaves after they turned 21. Not everybody adhered to this. This wasn't a law. This was more a practice.
Common practice.
Yeah, that was commonly used. But that created problems for other colonies around Pennsylvania, as now you started to have to deal with this fugitive slave issue or free Black populations that could be considered free in Pennsylvania and would be considered chattel slaves in Virginia. You'll really read more about that next week when we talk about the origins of African American slavery. That's
okay,
good.
Awesome. Thanks.
Yeah, no problem. All right. So then there's a big section on the origins of American slavery. Your test this chapter or this chapter assignment won't get too into the origins of slavery. That will really be held off until next week. If you look at chapter 4 from next week, it basically focuses on the rise of American slavery. It's called Slavery, Freedom, and the Struggle for Empire. So we'll really talk about the origins of slavery with this sort of shift into chattel slavery next week. So make sure you guys take notes on that section. You'll learn about the White Lion, the first African slaves brought to America aboard a Dutch ship, who actually got the slaves from a Portuguese ship that they raided. They end up trading those slaves in the Virginia colony for provisions that help them get back to Europe. And that starts the process of slavery in colonial America, or English colonial America. Then we see throughout the 17th century, these laws are passed, these slave laws and restrictions are passed to turn this process of slavery, what was really indentured servitude at the beginning, into the commodification of slaves, or what we would now call chattel slavery, where you can own a slave for life. They lose all rights in a court of law, their own sort of what we would call unalienable rights, human rights, are not protected by law. And keep in mind, this is still colonial America, so every colony will establish different colonial laws in terms of slaves. Tobacco, of course, is at the center of American slavery. We start to see this shift from indentured servitude to slaves. Slaves are preferable to most big plantations. Remember that this plantation society is really being established in Virginia and Maryland, the Carolinas to a little bit lesser of an extent, eventually into even south of that as rice plantations start to pick up in Georgia. So slaves are preferable for several reasons. One, they're less likely to escape. You have to think of the incredible cultural differences that these slaves are subjected to, how difficult it would be for a slave to escape a society and try to establish autonomy outside of these colonies. They're often, depending on the colony that we're talking about, they are forced into a lifelong servitude, a lifelong sentence of servitude. There's no opportunity to work your way out of slavery. We talked about how indentured servants usually work on a 7-year basis. They'll work as indentured servants for whoever paid their passage to the New World. And after 7 years, they're often granted their freedom. They're granted a little tract of land, some money, some dues that will help them establish themselves as their own personal or private farms. And also we'll see that these colonies start to enact laws that exclude slaves or exclude Africans or people of color from protection from the English court system. So these colonial societies often adopt the same court proceedings or adopt the same tenets of English law and apply those to colonies in America. Well, as the 17th century and then the 18th century wear on, more and more of these colonies are enacting stricter and stricter codes to make sure that slaves are commodified, to make sure they're stripped of their human rights, and that they are treated as property in the eyes of the law rather than as human beings. So we start to already see a division in 17th century colonial America between these central and southern colonies that are reliant on plantation agriculture, are reliant on agriculture as their main means of economic production, and how they become increasingly reliant on slave labor. That correlates with increasingly harsh laws applied to slaves that commodify slaves, compared to the North, which is smaller subsistence farming, more focused on religious refuges, more focused on a smaller family dynamics than these large plantation societies. The Portuguese are the first to dominate the West African slave trade. The Portuguese, we talked about briefly. Vasco da Gama is the first to sail around the tip of Africa. They have some very advanced navigation technologies. They're some of the first to really take advantage of the slave trade. This is the largest forced migration in the history of the world. We think between 10 and 15 million Africans were forced to migrate off the African colony, sent to European colonial holdings. Off the African continent, sent to various European colonial holdings, where they'll create what we now refer to as diaspora communities. A diaspora community is basically a group of people forced to live outside of their homeland under conditions of slavery or what have you. So about 12.5 million went to the New World. And out of those, only about 10.5 million survived the journey. About 400,000 of those came to North America. So out of 10 million, 10.5 million that survived the journey across the Atlantic Ocean, only about 400,000 went to English colonial America. The Portuguese imported millions and millions to their holdings in what are present-day Brazil. Central America and the Caribbean had millions of African slaves. So colonial America, North America, or English colonial America really wasn't the biggest proponent of slavery compared to other European empires across the Western Hemisphere. You'll read about the Triangle Trade. That's very important. The Middle Passage. Basically, the Triangle Trade, you'll be tested on this next week, but basically the Triangle Trade is this relationship between North American colonies, Europe, and the Gold Coast of Africa, where you have slaves transported from Africa to colonial America. You have them produce raw goods, which are then shipped to Europe. turned into finished products, which are then sold back to the colonies, sold in Europe, and sold to Africa itself. So it's sort of a triangle relationship that's often referred to as the triangle trade. You'll read about the horrors of the Middle Passage. Slaves are often chained together, packed into these cargo vessels in the bottom of these ships. Horrid sanitation, horrid conditions. You'll see stories. We'll look into the Middle Passage next week's secondary sources. You'll see the horrendous conditions. Then you'll get into some rebellion and resistance against the trade. So make sure you're taking notes on that section. You'll be tested on it next week. Another important factor is the sort of division of slavery among colonial America, American settlements. In the South, we see larger plantations and the need for greater and greater amounts of slaves, which will lead to a more rapid development of slave culture in the South. Wherever we see more slaves congregating or forced to live together, the more rapid development of what will be a unique African-American culture will develop. Then in the Chesapeake, sort of middle colonies, reliance on tobacco, we see fewer slaves, maybe 5 to 10 per plantation. And then in New England and the far north, we see really domestic slaves where households will have 1 or 2 slaves, but not near as prevalent as in the middle or southern colonies. All right. A good example of the difference between English perceptions of slavery and the Spanish is the 1662 law in Virginia, which defines who should be considered a slave or who should be considered African and who shouldn't. This really goes back to this idea that the English were really trying to preserve their sort of cultural autonomy. We talked about how they didn't intermarry with Native Americans. So we have a real sort of specific Anglo culture among English colonies, which looked to exclude African slaves, just like it excluded Native Americans from their colonization process. So the 62 law basically provides that a child of mixed race would be considered a slave based on the race of his or her mother. So this goes back to this patrilineal, matrilineal descent idea that we talked about. White English colonists considered patrilineal descent to determine the status of children, right? They take their father's name, they begin to, or they're part of their father's lineage. Well, the 1662 law says that children should be determined based on the race of their mother. This was a major shift from the patrilineal practices that were common among the English. And this is really because this is really one of the most egregious early slave laws, because it makes raping slave women acceptable and profitable for plantation owners. If a kid comes, or if the determination or the racial determination of a child comes from the race of the mother, then a white plantation owner can sexually abuse Black slave women to have mixed race children who will then be determined to be Black and forced to be slaves under that same plantation. So this is specifically designed to make it profitable to rape slave women, to have more slave children to work on your plantation. One of the most egregious examples of early colonial slave laws. All right, make sure you guys read about Bacon's Rebellion. Bacon's Rebellion. Sorry, one second. Make sure you guys read about Nathaniel Bacon. Bacon's Rebellion is an interesting example of these sort of patronage networks within colonial America. We talked about how Members of the church were often given the best pieces of land. If we're talking about New England, we had established, or English colonists had established this sort of small aristocracy in Maryland and Virginia, that a small proportion of the population owned a large portion of the property and wealth in these colonies. And so Bacon's Rebellion is an interesting example of a pushback against this stratified economic system in Virginia. So it surrounds this man named Nathaniel Bacon. He arrives to Virginia, and he's mad that William Berkeley has basically given all of his friends and supporters the best territory in Virginia. What's ironic is that Nathaniel Bacon himself is a bit of an aristocrat, or is an aristocrat, as part of this sort of elite class of Englishmen. But he has limited opportunity because all of the best territories have already been given away. So he starts by pushing William Berkeley to open up new territories, to challenge Native Americans in the region to open up new territories for white entrepreneurs, for white settlement. Behind the scenes, William Berkeley has a very profitable exchange, a very profitable trade going with these Virginia, or with these Chesapeake Native Americans. So he doesn't want to disrupt that profitable trade. So he denies these requests to push further and establish more white settlements. So Nathaniel Bacon gets a group of small farmers together to challenge the authority of William Berkeley. This is one of the first sort of class conflicts in colonial America. So his supporters are mainly working class, former indentured servants, working class individuals who want economic opportunity, who want that access to upward social mobility. So it's really an aristocrat fighting another aristocrat for the benefit of Nathaniel Bacon, but he's convinced these other farmers that we need to band together to try to fight this sort of unfair patronage network. At the same time, tobacco prices are falling, farmers aren't making enough money, and these indentured servants who are getting tracts of land after serving their servitude are angry that they've worked their 7 years and that they don't have access to upward social mobility. So it's a fairly successful rebellion. They lead the mob actually to the door of William Berkeley. They force William Berkeley, or they force him to concede defeat. And then they get a little too ambitious. They decide they're going to march to Jamestown and demand that their demands are met. Jamestown is a much bigger settlement. An English fleet is sent to put down the rebellion. William Berkeley and all of his dissenters, all of his supporters are hanged publicly to make sure that everybody knows what happens when you challenge the authority of the British Crown. But the most important aspect of this rebellion is that it frightens these colonial elites. They realize this system isn't going to work if we have to keep giving land and keep giving provisions to these indentured servants. It's much easier to just own slaves who never have access to freedom, own slaves that won't organize and rebel, or much less likely to organize and rebel against the colonial authority. So we see that this initiates this sort of huge explosion, or this huge shift from indentured servitude to chattel slavery. And over the first half of the 18th century, 1700 to 1750, slavery explodes in Virginia. 1705, the House of Burgesses enacts a slave code that basically establishes white supremacy into law, meaning that slaves cannot be protected by law. They become seen as property in the eyes of the court system. They can be bought and sold. They can be left in wills. They can be leased just like any other property. So the book refers this as a shift from a society with slaves to a slave society. A society with slaves is basically a society where slavery is one system of labor in a larger economic system. A slave society is a society where slavery stands at the center of their economic process. We're going to see Virginia as one of the biggest proponents of this slave society, where without slavery, Virginia's economy really could not function. And this is all a byproduct of this sort of unequal distribution of wealth, this sort of social stratification, and realizing that it's in this rich aristocracy's best interest to employ or to own chattel slaves rather than paying for somebody's passage to come over under a 7-year indentured servitude. All right, make sure you guys read about the Glorious Revolution as well. So the Glorious Revolution is another example of this struggle between the power of Parliament and the power of the king. We talked about this with the English Civil War and Oliver Cromwell establishing the parliamentary army to challenge the authority of the king. The Glorious Revolution is a continuance of this. It's a complicated story where actually a small group of aristocrats get with a few Dutch individuals with some interests in sort of shaking the power structures of England. You don't really need to know all about that. You just need to know that this is another step in establishing these sort of inalienable rights of all English subjects, right? This idea that if you're a subject of the English crown, you should have certain rights granted to you that can't be infringed by the crown, can't be infringed by the king or the queen. So this sort of establishes parliamentary supremacy, or at least protection of these, what will eventually be called natural or unalienable rights. In 1691, Massachusetts becomes or absorbs the Plymouth colony, becomes a royal colony. We talked about that last week. So this is going to impact the way a lot of these colonies or a lot of these colonists perceive their own liberties, perceive their own rights in these colonial power structures. So all of this is sort of setting the stage for these definitions of liberties. How are our liberties, how are colonial English liberties defined under English law? What rights are granted to the crown? What rights are granted to the people through parliamentary representation? And how does that affect liberties in colonial America? All right, then the book gets into sort of an over-discussed chapter of New England colonial history, the Salem witch trials. So I'm thinking about putting up an extra credit assignment on the Salem witch trials early next week. So read the section, take notes on it. I've already had several students ask if I can post some extra credit. Some students might not be doing as well in these chapter assignments as they hoped. So make sure you guys take notes on the Salem witch trial. There could be an extra credit assignment early next week on it. Basically, the Salem witch trial is a byproduct of this sort of religious fanaticism that has certainly been, we've certainly talked about in New England, in the Massachusetts colonies, and these colonies that are dominated by puritanical beliefs. But it extends extends further beyond this 17th century colonial beliefs. This craze over witchcraft really swept Europe at the end of the Middle Ages in the 1300s, 1400s, 1500s. It was often common to believe in sort of astrology and witchcraft and magic and these sort of supernatural beliefs. This is before what we call the Enlightenment, where these tenets of science are sort of inserted into everyday life. So it was very common to believe, oh, we had a bad crop yields this year. It's because we weren't holy enough or pious enough, or, oh, a hurricane hit and destroyed this town because it was infiltrated by the devil. So these issues are very prevalent. And this is an example of how this religious fanaticism, this sort of these mystical or pseudoscientific beliefs became very dangerous in colonial America. So it starts with a man named Reverend Parris, who's the first ordained minister of the Salem village. Salem is a settlement in the Massachusetts colony. And the Reverend's daughter, Elizabeth and Abigail, who are 9 and 11 years old, actually I think Abigail is Elizabeth's cousin, they start having fits and nightmares. So Reverend Parris believes in these sort of mythical and these sort of pseudoscientific ideas that the devil has the capability of possessing individuals or possessing entire communities. So he pressures these girls to point out, why are you having these fits? Why are you having these nightmares? And so these girls are put under immense pressure by a very powerful man in society to basically pass the blame to someone else. So they choose 3 people that are sort of living on the margins of society in Salem. One is Tituba, a slave woman from the Caribbean, and the 2 other white women who are sort of living on the fringes of society. They're homeless women. One is this Sarah Osborne, who's sort of seen as sort of a crazy woman in town. Sarah Good is a homeless woman who doesn't really support the church very much. So she chose these marginalized women to basically pass the buck. So these girls point to these other women and say they are the ones that are inspiring this possession. Tituba is from the Caribbean and supports the sort of mix of African and Protestant religions. We'll talk about this when we talk about development of slave culture, but they'll often take tenets of African religion and blend them together with stories from the Bible to create their own sort of religious denominations. And so this starts this crazy sort of moment or period of speculation across Salem, where if you are implicated as being somebody who was practicing the dark arts or what have you, then the best way to get heat off of you is to put the blame on somebody else. A major issue in this is this concept of evidence. What evidence can be supported in the courts? Well, in Salem, there were 2 court systems. There was a church court system and a civil court system, meaning that ministers were involved in the church court system and would accept ideas like spectral evidence as actual evidence. Spectral evidence is basically evidence based on dreams or based on visions that somebody may have. Spectral means a specter is a ghost. So it's not real evidence. It's this idea that, oh, she had a bad dream, so she's possessed by the devil. So at the same time, we know that in Massachusetts, they're also very focused on education, right? We talked about the establishment of Harvard College because reading literacy is very important to these Puritans. So Cotton and Increase Mather are 2 of the first presidents of Harvard College. And they're challenging the use of this spectral evidence. They're challenging that these church courts should even exist. Well, this snowballs out of control, and hundreds of women are implicated as being potentially possessed by the devil or being proponents of witchcraft and the devil. It goes so far as to where people are starting to accuse livestock, chickens and cows, that they're possessed by the devil. A girl as young as 4 years old is implicated as being a devil worshiper. And this is because this hysteria has created an environment where everybody's just trying to not be implicated themselves. So they're trying to pass the buck to several other individuals. So by the end, there are 14 women and 5 men executed in this period of hysteria. None of them are convicted under any actual evidence that would be supported in a court of law today. Hundreds of accusations are made. This snowballs into this hysterical event. Because of Cotton and Increase Mather challenging the legitimacy of these church courts, the Court of Oyer and Terminer, which is the church court, is actually dissolved. And they start to look at the standards of evidence that can implicate someone or that can lead to someone's conviction. You can no longer use spectral evidence or evidence tied to people's dreams or visions or so forth to actually convict someone in a court of law. So this starts the process of sort of moving away from these church courts. Well, the church courts were dissolved, and implementing scientific evidence into the this sort of burden of proof. Women were subjected to horrible torture during this event as well. It was common practice to press someone into saying what you wanted to say, basically. They would dunk women in chairs in the river to try to get them to confess. They would put them under boards and load rocks on top of the board until it smashed you to death, or you said, okay, I am a witch. So some incredibly horrible mistreatment of individuals under this church, or I'm sorry, under this Court of Oyer and Terminer. And what's important from this whole episode is that it moved these colonies away from the church court system and started implementing certain standards of evidence, what you could present in court to try to convict an individual of something. So keep all that in mind for next week. I'm pretty sure I will upload that extra credit opportunity for you guys next Monday. Then the end of the chapter talks about the growth of colonial America. We talked about this a little bit last week, but English colonial America grows very rapidly. By 1770, there's over 2 million English colonists in North America. We talked about how the Spanish only had, I think, 700,000 over 3 centuries of colonization. So we immediately see that the English want to establish permanent colonies, want to populate those colonies to relieve their population problems, whereas the Spanish are trying to extract gold and precious materials, convert Native Americans, and there are fewer concentrated Spanish urban centers or colonies with significant population. We start to see some diversified immigration, some the Scotch Irish, we have 145,000. Germans start to escape certain persecutions in Germany, religious persecutions mainly. The Scotch Irish really are much more skilled craftsmen and artisans, teachers and physicians. We'll see that they try to sort of maintain their cultural autonomy, much like the Germans do. Germans end up setting up their own communities. What we would call the German Triangle is eventually established in the Midwest. And they maintain their own culture. They maintain their own clothing, their own cultural practices, their own religious practices, their own languages. And we see evidence of this across the country still today, right? German communities, cities that, eventually in the 19th century, they migrate down the Mississippi, and we see in East Texas several German settlements, Fredericksburg and New Braunfels, and these are all initially German settlements. So all of this will lead to more diverse communities and challenges to both the aristocracy and this religious uniformity in many English colonies. We have some pseudo sort of progressive colonies, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, Maryland to a certain extent. We talked about how Maryland was sort of a Catholic refuge. So there's several different religions in Maryland. It's the only Catholic stronghold. We talked about how Rhode Island was established by people that were basically ostracized from the Massachusetts Puritan colonies, Anne Hutchinson and Roger Williams, and it becomes one of the most progressive in terms of religious tolerance. And so we're starting to see that this diversity is going to create problems or challenges to the established aristocracy and the established colonial religious systems. All right, guys. Let's make sure we covered the whole chapter here. Yeah, make sure you look up, read these sections on colonial artisans, like I was just mentioning, sort of challenging these colonial elites, aristocracies in the Carolinas. Always good to read some subaltern history, read about women and household economies in colonial America. And you should be good to go for the chapter assignment. Questions for me on chapter 3?
Absolutely, sir. I have a quick question. It's about the essay.
Okay, how about the chapter, guys? Let's talk about the chapter first.
Absolutely. Yeah. So you talk about like the witches and all that stuff that was about the chapter that we're gonna do, or like the church court and the slavery. That's for the next chapter, or that was for the
So the Salem witch trials is this chapter.
Okay, so witch trials.
There might be a question on it on your chapter assignment. I'm not sure. There's not a short answer question or anything, but I'm going to do an extra credit assignment for that early next week.
Okay, so it's going to be for next week. And about William Birkin and the Virginia, the slavery, that's for next week, right? That has to do with next week's chapter, or that was the review?
So next week's chapter is about slavery in total. It is about the origins of slavery, but you need to have notes on the sections on Virginia slavery, the White Lion, plantation slavery, and so forth. You need to take notes for this week.
Absolutely, thank you.
Sure. All right, guys. Also keep in mind your essays this week. Read the article that I've posted on religious tolerance before starting your essay, and keep in mind we expect to see a solid introduction, body, and conclusion. Try to come up with a thesis statement that is an argument, right? Not just a statement of fact. And use all those basic composition techniques that we discussed in the PowerPoint. We won't be super strict this week, but this is the first step in making sure you guys know how to write a solid essay, because you'll write several throughout the semester, including your midterm and your final. All right, guys, anything else? All righty, thanks very much, y'all. Have a good day. We'll see you guys next Wednesday.
Thank you. Have a good one.
You too.
Thank you, Mr. Just a quick question. For the essay, we're gonna have to submit it on Blackboard, or it's gonna be like,
Yes, you'll submit it on Blackboard.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so you open it just like the assignment. It'll give you the prompt, and then underneath is the area that you'll write the actual essay.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much.
How's everything else going, Angel? You feel like you're caught up?
Yeah, I feel like I'm caught up. Like I'm just like about the last assignments. I read the review. I was gonna see if there's like a way I could make those up.